Do you think you're better than everyone else? The furious voice echoed through the restaurant, silencing all conversations instantly. All eyes turned to a worn-looking man who pointed an accusing finger at a solitary customer near the window. What happened next would forever change the lives of everyone who witnessed that moment. It was a seemingly ordinary afternoon in downtown Philadelphia. The aroma of delicious food filled the cozy corner restaurant. Inside the establishment, the sound of conversations and silverware created a welcoming atmosphere. Christopher was sitting at a small table near the window, his tall figure slightly hunched over a thick book. He wasn't trying to draw attention, wearing a simple shirt and jeans, blending in naturally with the other customers. At least, that was his intention. He had chosen that place for a basic reason: a moment of peace. As a war veteran, his life had often been a sequence of difficult memories and efforts to readjust. But there, among unknown people enjoying their meals and looking at their cell phones, he found a rare sense of normalcy. Christopher was focused on his reading, when a loud, rough voice interrupted the tranquil atmosphere of the restaurant. "Do you think you're better than everyone else?" The voice was loud enough to make the conversation stop. Everyone looked at a man who was a few steps from Christopher's table. The man appeared to be about 45 years old, with a tired face and an angry expression. His clothes weren't bad, but they showed clear signs of someone who had gone through hardships. His posture was defiant, his body tense and rigid. For a moment, Christopher stood still, not out of fear, but out of surprise. This type of confrontation wasn't in his plans when he decided to visit this restaurant for a quiet meal. The tension increased as everyone watched the situation unfold. "You have it easy in life," the man continued, his voice trembling with frustration. "Do you even know what it means to really struggle?" The other customers exchanged uncomfortable glances, not knowing whether to intervene or remain silent. The waiter behind the counter hesitated, ready to grab the phone if necessary. Christopher's calm contrasted sharply with the man's irritation. He closed the book slowly, placing it on the table, and looked at the man. "Sir," he said, in a firm but serene voice, "I don't know exactly what's bothering you, but maybe we can talk about it." The man laughed contemptuously. "Talk? You want to talk? What could someone like you say that I would want to hear?" The restaurant became completely silent. People waited, almost without breathing, for what would happen next. But instead of responding to the man's hostility, Christopher did something that no one expected, and it transformed everything. Christopher relaxed in his chair, his posture calm but alert. The man's anger seemed to fill the entire environment, making even those who watched from afar feel uncomfortable. But Christopher remained calm. Instead of reacting negatively, he pointed to the empty chair in front of him. "Please, sit down," he said quietly, in a tone that lessened the tension. The unexpected invitation surprised the man, but his shoulders remained stiff. He remained standing, with his fists clenched, staring at Christopher angrily. The man sneered. "Why would I want to sit with someone like you? You're just another guy who will never understand what it's like to live in the real world." Some customers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, whispering to each other. The waiter made a discreet movement, as if considering whether he should do something. But Christopher maintained his composure. "Maybe you're right," Christopher acknowledged, in a calm voice. "I haven't lived your experiences, but if you sit down, maybe you can tell me what it's like." For a moment, the man seemed to hesitate. Christopher's tone wasn't a challenge, but a sincere invitation. However, instead of sitting down, the man leaned further forward, lowering his voice, but maintaining his acidic tone. "You think I have an obligation to tell you my story. You think that will make you feel better about yourself." He attacked, with words full of sarcasm. Christopher continued looking at him without looking away. "I believe everyone has a story that deserves to be heard," he replied. His words hung in the air, cutting through the silence. The man paused, as if deciding whether to continue attacking or accept the unexpected kindness. Meanwhile, the other customers continued watching, their curiosity now mixed with a strange sense of hope. They didn't know where this would lead, but they couldn't stop paying attention. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the man grabbed the back of the empty chair and dragged it across the floor with a loud noise. He sat down abruptly, crossing his arms defensively. His jaw was tense, his eyes examining Christopher as if looking for some flaw in his calm. "All right," he muttered. "You want to hear about the real world? I'll tell you." The atmosphere in the restaurant changed. Not completely, but it was no longer so oppressive. The waiter took his hand off the phone. The customers leaned forward slightly, pretending not to be listening, but attentive to every word. Christopher nodded, leaning slightly forward. "I'm listening," he said simply. And then the man began to speak. But what came next wasn't just a story, it was a revelation. The man took a deep breath, as if trying to find strength. When he spoke, his voice was lower, but still full of emotion. "You look at me and only see someone angry for no reason, but you don't know what it's like to lose everything," he began, his words full of bitterness. He looked around the restaurant as if challenging someone to interrupt him before looking back at Christopher. "I had a good job, a family, a decent life. But then the factory where I worked closed. Overnight, it was over. Hundreds of us were left with nothing, just empty promises that they would help us find new jobs. Promises that were never kept." The restaurant was completely silent, except for the distant sound of the kitchen. The man's voice began to fail as he continued, his harshness falling apart with each phrase. "I tried to stay strong for my wife and children. I took any job that came up. But when you're struggling to survive, anything can bring you down. My wife left me, took the children, said she couldn't live like this anymore." He paused, his eyes watering. "And I can't even blame her for it." Christopher remained silent, his face showing no reaction, but the empathy in his eyes was unmistakable. The man looked at the table, his fingers tracing the designs of the wood distractedly, as if looking for some support. "Do you know what it's like to walk into a place and realize that everyone is looking at you, judging you, thinking you're worthless? That's my life now, every day." The words hit not only Christopher, but everyone who was listening. A woman at a nearby table shifted in her chair, suddenly interested in her plate, as if she was processing what she had just heard. "And then I see someone like you," the man continued, his voice rising slightly, "sitting here, in your nice clothes, reading a book as if you have no problems in the world. And it makes me furious, because no matter how hard I try, I'll never have what you have." His words hung in the air like a dark cloud, heavy and laden. Christopher didn't rush to respond. He allowed the man's pain to be expressed, respecting its importance. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I don't know what it's like to be in your place," Christopher said gently, "but I know what it's like to be judged, to feel like people have already decided who you are before you even say a word." The man looked up quickly, his eyes narrowed. "What could you know about that?" Christopher's response wasn't what anyone in the restaurant expected. It changed the conversation and the entire atmosphere in a way that no one could have imagined. Christopher took a deep breath, his tranquility making the tension seem to diminish. He leaned forward, meeting the man's distrustful gaze with firmness. "You may think I have an easy life from what you see now, and in part you're right. I'm not going through the same financial difficulties as you, but that doesn't mean I don't know the feeling of being misunderstood," Christopher began, in a calm voice, but carrying a weight that made everyone in the restaurant pay even more attention. The man made a sound of contempt, ready to interrupt, but Christopher raised his hand, not rudely, but as if asking, "Just listen. Wherever I go since I came back from military service, people make assumptions about me. They think they know who I am, what I've seen, what I've done, just because I wore a uniform. They don't see me as a person. They see a stereotype, someone on whom they can project their own frustrations, more or less like what's happening now. The man's face twitched, as if Christopher's words had touched something deep. He didn't say anything, but his posture changed slightly, his arms uncrossing a little. Christopher continued, his tone thoughtful and sincere. I'm not saying my problems are the same as yours. They're not. But pain is something we all feel. Feeling invisible or misunderstood. That's something we all face, no matter where we come from. The restaurant was completely silent, a dense silence, full of reflection. Even the waiter had stopped in his tracks, his tray momentarily forgotten. Christopher leaned back a little, giving the man space to process what he had just heard. I'm not here to argue with you, or to try to change your opinion. I just want to understand, because I think we all carry burdens that no one else sees, and maybe we would be kinder to each other if we knew that. The man's chin tightened, and for a moment it seemed like he might become hostile again, but instead he let out the air sharply, as if releasing a weight he had been carrying for a long time. Do you really believe that? He asked, his voice lower now, almost insecure. Christopher nodded. I believe it, and I think deep down you believe it too. Otherwise, you wouldn't have told me your story. The man blinked, his outward toughness breaking down a little more. He ran his hand over the back of his neck, looking around the restaurant, as if realizing for the first time how many people were watching. A moment of embarrassment crossed his face, but then he looked back at Christopher. You're not what I expected, he admitted, in a softer tone. But the real surprise wasn't what Christopher said next. It was what the man did in response. The man leaned back in his chair, his body language changing from defensive to reflective. For a long moment, he said nothing. The restaurant was in suspense, all the customers awaiting the unfolding of that situation. Finally, he spoke, his voice without the previous hostility. You know, I came in here angry at the world, he said, shaking his head. Angry at people like you, who I thought had it easy in life. But maybe I've carried that anger for too long. Maybe it's not about you after all. Christopher didn't respond immediately. He let the man's words be absorbed, respecting their importance. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and clear. I think it's easy to blame people we don't know. It's harder to face what's really hurting us. But you did that today, and I respect that a lot. The man looked up, his eyes meeting Christopher's. For the first time, there was no anger in them, just a kind of weary gratitude. You're a good guy, he said, almost reluctantly, as if the admission was difficult. I don't usually say that often. The change in the environment was evident. The tension that dominated the restaurant dissipated, replaced by an unexpected feeling of human connection. The waiter smiled discreetly as he returned to work. A couple at a nearby table exchanged glances, their expressions softer. Then the man did something that surprised everyone. He extended his hand over the table, palm up. Christopher hesitated for just a second before shaking it firmly. I'm sorry, the man said, his voice thick with emotion, for judging you before I even knew you. Christopher smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his face. And I'm sorry if I ever gave you reason to feel that way. The handshake lasted a moment before the man pulled away. He stood up, adjusting his shirt awkwardly, and looked around the restaurant. I think I owe everyone here an apology too, he said, his voice echoing through the room. I came in here full of anger, but this guy, he reminded me that sometimes we just need to listen to each other. The restaurant responded with a restrained applause, not exaggerated, but sincere. The man nodded, visibly moved, and walked to the door, He stopped briefly before leaving and looked at Christopher. "Thank you," he said simply, and then left. What happened next wasn't as dramatic, but it left everyone in the restaurant with something to reflect on, a moment they wouldn't easily forget. When the door closed, the restaurant seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Conversations slowly resumed, but they were different. There was a new energy in the air, a shared understanding between strangers who had just witnessed something out of the ordinary. Christopher returned to his position, picked up his book, and took a sip of water. But before he could return to his solitary reading, a lady from a nearby table approached. She appeared to be about 60 years old, with kind eyes and a welcoming smile. "Young man," she said softly, "I just want to say that what you did was extraordinary. You didn't have to listen to that man, but you chose to listen. And I think you reminded all of us that sometimes a gesture of kindness is all we need to change things." Christopher nodded with a humble expression. "Thank you, Ma'am. I think we all just want to be understood." The lady smiled and returned to her table, leaving Christopher with his thoughts. Around him, the restaurant vibrated with a different energy. Customers smiled at each other, starting conversations and offering small gestures of kindness, opening doors, exchanging smiles, and even paying bills for strangers. When Christopher left the restaurant, the day seemed brighter, not just for him, but for everyone who witnessed that moment. The man's anger, Christopher's empathy, and the simple act of listening had triggered a chain reaction of understanding and compassion. As he walked down the street, Christopher reflected on how small gestures can have such a significant impact. He didn't know the man's whole story, and he probably never would. But in that restaurant, during those brief moments, they connected, and that connection had transformed the atmosphere of an entire environment. Maybe that's what we need sometimes, Christopher thought to himself. Just a little empathy to remind us that, deep down, we're not so different from each other. This story isn't just about Christopher or the man he met that day. It's about all of us. The way we carry our difficulties, how we judge others, and how we can choose to listen instead of reacting. If this story touched you, take a moment today to practice a little kindness. And if you want to know more stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's spread more understanding, one story at a time.